There's something especially striking about how Kid Cudi's music impacts his fans. Many have cited his work as the reason they're still alive, that his words served as a much needed life raft during tumultuous times. While this isn't unique to Kid Cudi, it's notable that the greater themes in his music seem to resonate on a profound level. He expresses something vital and genuine about loneliness, anger, depression, and fighting for even a speck of hope in the midst of what feels like relentless despair. He spearheaded an emotional vulnerability in hip-hop that greatly influenced the eventual rise of emo rap. In a genre filled with bravado and unyielding pride, he stood out as he spoke about the feelings that kept him up at night. His public struggles with depression and addiction revealed a flawed and fallible person, prone to making mistakes again and again. It's something that's consistently been reflected in his music, painting him as a lonely and at times tortured soul. Yet even still, he's committed himself to helping others persist through their own struggles with unhappiness. In this video, I want to talk about how Kid Cudi helped a generation feel seen as he chronicled his own emotional journey, and how he rediscovered his peace and serenity along the way. Like many of us, I first discovered Kid Cudi through his hit single Day and Night. The song was a hypnotic track with a hook that felt coated in stardust the moment it hit. On the surface, it encapsulated a spaced out tranquility, with the atmospheric beat laying the foundation for Cudi's layered melodies. But his lyrics alluded to insomnia and the internal restlessness of lying awake at night, alone with thoughts you don't quite know how to deal with. Of course, the song's catchiness gave it a widespread appeal, but I think what drew a lot of us to it, and to Kid Cudi, was the anxiousness he hinted at as he described the endless thoughts swirling uncontrollably in his head. At times, it felt like these thoughts overwhelmed him, with the menacing bass coming midway through the song to highlight their creeping presence. For Cudi and many listeners, he used drugs as a way to escape these uncomfortable thoughts. Day and Night felt like the tip of the iceberg, a small glimpse of the immense sadness he felt, hidden away underneath the veneer of a trippy song about getting high. It proved to be a pivotal moment in his career, as its success helped launch his debut mixtape, A Kid Named Cudi. With collaborators Dr. Genius and Plain Pat, he cultivated a sound that fused indie rock aesthetics with hip-hop in a way that allowed him to convey emotions rarely expressed in the genre.
Cudi's become this real mythical character for I think people of a certain age, because he was just speaking frankly on his tracks in a way that nobody was used to hearing rappers speak.
He played the role of a carefree stoner in songs like Maui Wowie, which literally ends in a wet fart. Maui Wowie. But there was an underlying sorrow that defined his lyrics. He was still getting high to have fun, relieve stress, and party, but also to self-medicate for a trauma he was never able to properly address. From the first track of the mixtape, it's evident the death of his father still lingered on his mind, having passed away when Cudi was only 11. The sting of his absence frequently pops up in his lyrics.
For even in hell, I still have faith to one day be free with my father at the gates.
When asked about it in an interview, he said, "Going through all that heartache and loss made me super sensitive. Not to where I want to cry all the time, but I'll want to snap. There's a lot of anger still in me, and it transforms into sadness through song." Clearly, the loss caused him to feel isolated and made death an ever-looming presence in his mind, whether it was of a loved one or his own. It's a feeling that's touched on in A Kid Named Cudi, but was further explored in his studio debut, Man on the Moon, The End of Day. The album featured glossy production that complemented the story of Cudi's rise to fame and fortune.
But the theme is definitely kind of like my rise to fame and what I envisioned in my brain. It's a mixture of stuff that I've dealt with and visions that I've had in my dreams.
But I think the most notable theme in the album was the emptiness he still felt in the midst of achieving this success. Broken into 5 acts chronicling his life as a lonely kid struggling to express his emotions, the album's title hints at his feelings of isolation, alluding to both a fatalistic worldview about the inevitability of death and also the peace found in the night by insomniacs. In these late nights, his loneliness no longer becomes this haunting feeling, but a comforting seclusion where he can free his mind and ease the restlessness that plagues him throughout the day. At the heart of the album is Cudi's search to find contentment, and in turn, guide his listeners to find their own version of it. In a Hip Hop DX interview, he said, "The moon is pretty much my place of peace, whether it's a room or in my mind. It's really your own personal space. It can be interpreted any different way. I didn't want to have it so literal. I want kids to interpret it and find their own moon in their world." And while most of the album covers his struggles with depression, Man on the Moon paints the trauma and emotional turmoil he experienced like a hero's journey, events that ultimately shaped him into a stronger, more mature and self-assured person. But even with this conclusion, there's a persistent despair he can't quite shake. I think it's most evident in Solo Dolo, an ominous song where he whispers through his verses like he's telling a secret, revealing the growing isolation he feels.
Listen good, I don't have nobody. Feeling alone and just making all the wrong decisions and just being wrapped up in that, you know, and feeling worthless. That definitely was a chapter in my life that I lived once.
Initially, Cudi maintains a bravado in accepting his reality, embracing his solitude, but the ending refrain reveals that it's all a facade.
When will I ever learn from the words in my songs?
While the song and also the album paint an image of a defiant Kid Cudi, overcoming his depression to find an inner tranquility and inspiring his fans to find their own happiness, in reality, he still succumbs to the pitfalls of his worst inhibitions, struggling to listen to his own advice. He later acknowledged that during this time, he developed a cocaine addiction, which caused him to spiral to new lows. And I think that's why his follow-up album, Man on the Moon 2, The Legend of Mr. Rager, sounded much more grim than its predecessor.
Mom's calling, think I see it decline. I'm numb-faced while I'm thinking about suicide.
He still sends the same message of perseverance, broken into 5 acts, but this time, he's clearly more beaten down by life, his newfound fame, and the responsibility that came with it. In a Complex interview in 2010, he said, "A boy crumbles from stress, a man could take some punches, and I've been getting sucker punched for a long time. Life's been beating the shit out of me, mentally and physically, but life is one big fucking joke, so I'm laughing inside." In Man on the Moon 2, his trademark hums are more apparent than ever as he opens up about the depths of which he's fallen mentally and emotionally. As described by Dr. Suk Joon Kim in this Genius video, humming is an intimate act that creates a sense of closeness and solidarity.
Yeah, I think Cudi's humming is very intimate because he allows us into himself and shows us his loneliness and anxiety.
So as Cudi hums and speaks about his loneliness, mental anguish, and drug abuse, he creates a kinship to listeners who've had similar experiences, effectively telling them that they're not alone in their journey. One of the more notable instances of this happened with Mr. Rager. Sprinkled with echoey sine waves, Cudi's chanting vocals feel like a spiritual hymn. The song struck a chord with his fans, as he later revealed those about a near overdose, with heaven representing the calming release of death. The music video sees Cudi assume the alter ego of Mr. Rager, the embodiment of Cudi's addiction and his persona when he's under the influence. Paying tribute to the raid, he fights an endless swarm of goons until he's ultimately subdued by another version of himself. Though for one fan in particular, the song had a deeply profound impact.
My name is Ben, and I'm 17.
In the early days of YouTube, vlogger Ben Breedlove revealed he'd been living with a serious heart condition, and that in his third near-death experience, while going in and out of consciousness, he had a vision of heaven where Cudi appeared to guide him to the afterlife, all while Mr. Rager played in the background. The video went viral and even circulated back to Cudi before Ben tragically died a week later. His video illustrated the effect Cudi's music had on his audience. He felt like a friend to the lonely, the misunderstood, and the outcast who had no one else to confide in. And for Ben, Kid Cudi helped him find solace in the face of his mortality. Cudi's willingness to openly rap about his despair is what set him apart from other artists. He wasn't afraid to admit that life was hell and things weren't okay, but he gave listeners hope that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. Regarding this, he said, "I want people just to look at me as that big brother or little brother in the family, that just is trying to become a man and figuring things out in life, when the fuzzy things happen and things get the most confusing. I want my fans and critics to look at me as their little or big brother, and that's all, and to understand me, and embrace the fact that I know I'm not perfect, and I'm putting it out there in my music so other people can learn from it, and learn from my ignorance too." But while he made it a mission to help those in need, I think the gravity of his words started to weigh heavily on him.
I don't understand why Ben thought of me in his vision. I didn't ask to be this hero to people, and it's something that I'm still adjusting to.
At first, he was simply trying to tell his story and connect with an audience, but eventually, I think it started to scare him. Knowing that he meant this much to people, it made him question if he was really capable of handling that responsibility, and that pressure seemed to push him further towards his vices and demons.
You know, I would wake up in the morning, I would, do coke immediately, even before I had cereal, breakfast.
Whoa.
And then I would have a beer, and then I would smoke weed.
By the early 2010s, Cudi seemed to be at the height of his career, collaborating with the likes of Jay-Z and Kanye West. But while making the two Man on the Moon albums, his vices started to be a crutch he leaned on to get through each day. In an interview with Spin, he said, "I started doing drugs to get through interviews, because when people started to ask a lot of personal questions about my childhood, I found it terribly hard. So I started doing cocaine to be more upbeat. I'd do bumps and smoke weed, so I wouldn't be so edgy."
When it happened, I wasn't like, I have a statement that I issue here. Sorry if I let anyone down. Fuck that. You know, fuck that. It was really just like, I'm dealing with some shit. If you don't understand it, I don't give a fuck. This is how I was surviving. If I didn't do it, I would have blew my brains out.
So when he released his next album, Indicud, it didn't quite provide his fans the same catharsis as his previous work. In the album, he often reflects on his dependency on drugs over a variety of droning, psychedelic synths and quiet, brooding instrumentals.
When it rains, it pours, whiskey bottles on the 16 floors. Every day the fight says a chore. If you'd like to know, yes, I am on acid.
But an eventual arrest, along with the birth of his daughter, served as a wake-up call and led him to try to cut off drugs altogether.
This is not about Kid Cudi being a role model to the fans anymore and me being scared to be that. This is a whole nother beast here. You know, I'm a father now.
Yet Cudi's sobriety only caused him to feel more isolated and lonely. He was getting high to cope, and now for the first time, he was forced to confront the depth of his mental health without the benefit of drugs to alleviate it, and he was miserable. During this period, the hums that arguably defined his sound became less and less present while he delved further away from the music he'd previously made. His lyrics grew more cynical, hinting at the thoughts of suicide growing louder in his psyche. Fans clamored for a third installment of the Man on the Moon series, but if the moon represented his peace, I don't think Cudi was comfortable making another in the series unless he found that same place of serenity. Of course, he also wanted to explore other artistic directions, but I think it speaks to how Cudi was dealing with depression by himself, without properly treating it or confiding in anyone, a phenomenon reflected in Solo Dolo too.
I don't need nobody.
Regarding this time period, he said, "I really came out of that drug shit. People don't know how real it was. I used drugs to try to fix my depression. Playing rock was my way of saying, fuck everyone." It's a defiant attitude that would persist through the next handful of projects after Man on the Moon 2. He was dropping an album every year, seemingly to find something to distract him from the state of his mental health.
2012, 2013, 2014, 2015,
Yeah.
2016.
It was almost obsessive.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, okay, I can't be the man on the moon anymore because that's dangerous for my health.
Yeah.
But I'm going to stay super productive the entire time.
And gradually, he embraced more rock influences in his music, even teaming up with Dr. Genius to form the rock band Wizard. His eventual aesthetic shift is hinted at in Troubled Boy, the last song in Kid Cudi Presents Satellite Flight, The Journey to Mother Moon. Troubled Boy holds a noticeable influence from Nirvana, with the stripped-down guitar riff setting an ominous mood underneath Cudi's haunting vocals.
No one wants a trouble boy, leave alone the trouble boy.
I was dealing with my alone. I was really good at keeping my troubles hidden, even from my friends.
It ends with an eerie farewell, like a last gasp before he ends his life. While hip-hop listeners eventually welcomed rock elements, Cudi's continual exploration into the genre alienated his fanbase. It felt like he was abandoning the themes and sounds that connected him to so many people. But Cudi, privately and sometimes publicly, was struggling to maintain being that beacon of hope anymore, and his music reflected that. Troubled Boy felt like a direct precursor to his next album, Speedin Bullet to Heaven, a straightforward grunge project featuring some of the most self-hating and pessimistic lyrics I'd ever heard. Sonically, it was crude and rough, as if the audio was mixed with sandpaper. It showcased Cudi's rock bottom, as he left behind any semblance of his previous sound in favor of a discomforting and unpleasant experience. He took inspiration from Montage of Heck, a posthumous collection of Kurt Cobain's unreleased songs, and adopted a slurred vocal delivery, absorbing the messy and bare-bones aesthetic of the grunge icon. I think the most emblematic song on the album is Confused. In the distorted track, he confesses to having suicidal ideations and admits to the intense shame he holds because of these thoughts. He later revealed the album was, quote, how a suicidal man sounds when he's alone at night, and elaborated on his theme, saying, I was dealing with some real shit during that album. One of my darkest. I just wanted to scream and yell and make angry songs. It was the only way I could express what I was feeling at the time. Less than a year after its release, Cudi entered rehab for depression and suicidality.
It's like I became invincible. The Rager character was a real thing. I became obsessed with all the greats that could have possibly been dealing with the same thing psychologically. Morrison and Hendrix and then Kurt. Even if I die this way, then this is destiny.
To this day, Cudi is reluctant to discuss Speedin Bullet to Heaven in depth because of all the complicated and unsettling emotions he pulled from to make it.
I don't know if I want to talk about Confused because that was like a really dark time for me. I don't want to talk about any song from Speedin Bullet.
Okay, cool.
But even with such an emotionally honest project, critics and fans generally seem to reject this artistic direction, and I think the response hurt him. He was opening up about the darkest time in his life, only for the art to be dismissed as subpar. So on his next album, Passion, Pain, and Demon Slayin, he tried to recapture his happiness again, but it was a struggle.
Like, I never really thought about, well, why am I depressed? You know, I found out that it was stuff from years ago when I was a kid. Like from my father dying when I was 11, and you know, and then my cousin dying, and then my favorite uncle dying like 3 years in a row.
Cudi's rehab stint occurred just weeks before the album was released, and during his time there, he suffered a stroke at the age of 32. Passion, Pain, and Demon Slayin saw the return of his soothing hums as he searched for the peace he once had. I think this search is best exemplified in Rose Golden.
All I ever wanted was to find some inner peace.
Featuring angelic strings, the song is a reflection of his journey, looking back at the hardships in his life and appreciating the fact he's still here.
How did we make it to this level all in one piece?
The album felt like Cudi's process of cleansing himself and rediscovering his passion for life. He was still beaten down, but now it felt like he made it through the worst and was ready to rejoice again. It featured up-tempo tracks and arena anthems that reflected Cudi's aspiration to move past his demons. But like Rehabilitation, it wasn't quite a polished and complete journey of recovery and renewal, but it was the first step in his process of healing. So if Passion, Pain, and Demon Slayin was the beginning of Cudi's rediscovery of peace, his next albums would be about bandaging his wounds and moving forward. In the years after Man on the Moon 2, one of the relationships that seemed to crumble as he dealt with his mental health was his friendship with Kanye West. The two had an undeniable musical chemistry that showcased itself in some of the best rap songs of the last decade.
Ain't no question if I want it, I need it. Not the one that become. Beautiful morning, you're the sun of my morning, babe.
Yet they often butted heads, constantly taking jabs at each other about petty disagreements that eventually escalated to publicly dissing each other in 2016. But after leaving rehab, I get the sense Cudi was ready to start anew and put the past behind him. In an interview with Billboard, he said, "Me and Kanye are brothers. With family, there's always going to be issues. Whatever we were dealing with, it was a beautiful thing to clear the air about. I'm really happy to be back working with my friends." Of course, the peace didn't last long because Kanye is Kanye, but it led to the release of Kid Cudi Ghost, a 7-track fusion of psychedelic rock and hip-hop encompassing both Kanye and Cudi's personal journey struggling with mental health and addiction, painting the two like prodigal sons, reuniting after facing their respective demons.
So that's why Kid Cudi Ghost was so big, because it was like, for the first time in forever, in the history of my career, I was like really excited about doing some new shit that was positive and like wasn't a downer and it was like uplifting.
For Cudi, Kid Cudi Ghost stood out because it reflected his growing ability to withstand the brunt of his depression, despite the toll it's taken on him.
I can still feel love.
Specifically in Reborn, a beautifully cathartic track, he echoes the sentiment of his Facebook post when he checked into rehab.
I'm so reborn. I'm moving forward.
In the song, Cudi mournfully recollects on how lost he felt, searching for a way to distract himself from his seemingly unending sadness. As if with tears trickling down his face, his hums feel like the only sound he can muster without bursting into tears. He acknowledges how close he was to drowning in his despair, before realizing he couldn't rely on his vices or anyone else to fix his problems.
Peace is something that starts with me.
It's a beautiful track that succinctly conveys the emotions of someone closed off in the darkest moments of his life, finally able to step outside and embrace the world again. The sentiment continues through the rest of the album, and most distinctly appears at the conclusion of Cudi Montage. The song's title calls back to Kurt Cobain's Montage of Heck, and even samples one of its songs. While Kanye's verse focuses on the cycle of systemic racism and incarceration, Cudi describes being lost in a perpetual pattern of dejection and self-hatred.
I'm caught in again, see him all strapped and I can't move and I'm singing low.
But Cobain's looping guitar riff makes his presence feel like the proverbial ghost the kids see, guiding them through the same sullen passage he traversed before them, leading them out of the pit of despair that once consumed him. Through Cudi's layered vocals harmonizing to create a transcendent, soul-piercing chorus, the song is a call to persevere through the demoralizing cruelty of the world and the self-sabotaging thoughts that cloud our self-worth, pushing us to break free of the endless cycle of tragedy and anguish. While Cudi's reconciliation with Kanye was short-lived, his effort to mend it speaks to a newfound self-assuredness. In the past, the friendship's deterioration might have caused him to spiral again, but in an interview with Esquire, he said, "The twisted thing is that I love him, but I love you so much that I can kick you the fuck out of my life and be done with your ass, cause you're not good for me. I didn't love myself all them years you knew me. I love myself more now." For the first time, it seemed he was actively making decisions to benefit his mental health, and because of this, I think he was more capable of handling the responsibility of being that beacon of hope so many of his fans needed him to be. So in his next album, Man on the Moon 3, The Chosen, he again returns to themes of loneliness. As the back cover of the album states, in the last 10 years, Scott Muscudi has been through hell and back. After feeling like his world was over, he found hope and overcame the darkness that was plaguing his life. But happiness isn't forever. He finds himself lost, dealing with the same pain he hadn't felt in years. And one night, he must face himself again and fight back to win his soul from the evil Mr. Rager. But this time around, there's a zen quality to how he discusses loneliness. He comes off like a wizened wanderer, already equipped with the tools necessary to survive the terrain. It speaks to his growing maturity and confidence in the limelight. In the aforementioned Esquire interview, he said, "I'm ready to wear those shoes and be a role model. Being a big brother is very, very rock and roll, and I will not apologize for shit. I'm so in tune with my emotions. As I've gotten older, I've learned how to manage and control those emotions." Man on the Moon 3 starts off with a familiar melody, calling back to the previous albums in the series as Cudi treks across woozy, atmospheric beats. In songs like Damage, he acknowledges the permanent scars he's accumulated from a lifetime of trauma. And while there's a sense of tranquility in how he raps about these long-standing emotions, he admits to still having the urge to isolate and detach himself from the world. It's most apparent in Solo Dolo Part 3. Sampling the opening scene of 2019's The King, the epic soundscape creates a cosmic quality to Cudi's sadness, like he's been warped in a black hole of his emotions. In the song, he continues the lyrical thread of loneliness, with his delicate hums embodying a weathered soul reaching the conclusion of his journey. Like the rest of the album, Cudi doesn't necessarily touch on new themes, but his revival of them paint him like a conquering hero, returning to tell tales of his adventures. He still lives with regret, sometimes even reverting back to his worst habits.
Tell my mom I'm sorry.
At one time, Cudi was unsure of how to deal with the effect his music had on his audience, but now he seems more capable than ever to pick himself back up, and in turn, embrace what he meant to so many listeners.
I got the end of Ghost tattooed on my arm. Every single day I think I listen to that album. That album like helped get it like all out. Way more than I think anything else did.
Oh,
Thank
bro.
you.
Give me a hug.
Yeah.
Just as Kurt Cobain was his guiding light in Cudi montage, Man on the Moon 3 was Cudi's way of guiding his audience through their own respective paths. So it's no wonder he paid tribute to Cobain in his SNL performances of Damaged and Sad People, donning a floral patterned dress and later a green cardigan, calling back to Cobain's Unplugged performance. Man on the Moon 3 was the final installment in the series as Cudi closed this chapter in his life, a chapter consisting of self-loathing and doubt. But along with potentially leaving these themes behind, he's hinted that he may be done with music altogether.
I just don't know if I wanna just do music, drop albums for too much longer. You know, I'm kind of nearing the end on all things Kid Cudi. I think I'm really curious to see what else I can do.
Of course, we know how it goes when an artist says they're retiring. There's usually more than just a grain of salt in those statements, but I think Cudi's ready to explore other aspects of his creativity. After Man on the Moon 3, he went on to produce Entergalactic, an animated Netflix film with an accompanying original soundtrack/album. Its title is a nod to the song from his first album. And For the first time, the themes in his music weren't based on loneliness or sadness, but simply love and the joy of finding it. There's a refreshing, carefree weightlessness to Entergalactic, relaying the simple idea that though we may occasionally find solace in solitude, it can be worthwhile to break out of that comfort zone. Whether he actually stops making music and transitions to writing or acting, he's proven that the demons that tormented him in the past aren't necessarily gone, but he won't let them paralyze him anymore. The road might get rocky, but he'll be okay. And if there's anything Kid Cudi's tried to say through his music, it's that we'll be okay too. Thanks for watching the video. I know the holidays are coming up, and it can be a really tough time for a lot of people that feel lonely or isolated, and I hope Kid Cudi, or whatever brings you joy, can help you find a little bit of peace in this time. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Check out our Patreon. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.